morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming and attending the third installment of our Africa Spotlight series. I gaze at the audience and I see some familiar faces, and that's comforting. So I know you would have been privy to the initial installments yesterday afternoon. Over the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to be focusing on Southern Africa. And as I indicate, many of you will be familiar with the format, the methodology, the framework that we adopted yesterday to introduce the content. I also have two very fitting guests who I will invite to the stage in a moment, after I've made my introductory remarks and given you some insight into the opening exhibits. And I have no doubt they will be a delicious contribution to this conversation. I know I'm quite excited. As was the format yesterday, let me not defer at great length and just give you some sense of the breadth and span, the heterogeneity of the region. Again, like West Africa, like East Africa, you find yourself in a zone where there are populous countries with respectable levels of output, and then there are countries as well with fairly small levels of population and similarly, sometimes shallower levels of GDP. But even those shallower levels of annual output don't necessarily infer low per capita income. So for example, with the case of Botswana, as you will see in a moment. In terms of economic growth, the region has underperformed cyclically over the recent years for a variety of reasons. If you consider that South Africa is the largest economy, in excess of $300 billion, South Africa's growth buoys the region's growth. So, for instance, every 1 percentage point of South Africa growth exports or generates anything between 0.4 and 0.7 of a percentage point of growth in the region. So South Africa clearly has a cascading effect in terms of buoying the rest of the region, and naturally when South Africa underperforms, the manner in which it has over the recent years, it somewhat tempers the zone in a direct and an indirect manner. Nonetheless, hopefully there's some promise for South Africa over the medium term to help to buoy the rest of the zone. But aside from South Africa, inclement weather has been somewhat unkind to the agricultural output in the district, as well as tempering electricity production, especially in markets like, say, Zambia, that are pretty dependent on hydro function for their power sources. Yesterday I introduced the theory of the spending ladder. I gave you a sense of how with progressive gains in per capita income, so too is there an evolution in the basket of consumption items that an individual or a household will purchase. So this would have at least been, I hope, emblazoned in your minds twice already. But while you're seeing it for the third time, let me make an additional theoretical remark that you may not, well, I certainly didn't introduce yesterday. The way you think about the spending ladder is accompanied by a concept of S curves, sugar curves, S for sugar. In other words, as income rises, a household will go through an S-shaped curve of consumption. The best way I could describe that is perhaps through an example. So if you consider an exceedingly marginal household, a very poor household, that has very superficial income. And when I say marginal, you'd imagine if there's a government subsidy or aid, that household may be purchasing, say, and privy to a single meal of maize in a day. And let's just say there's a little bit of a bump up in that household's income, sufficient to be able to afford 2 servings of maize in a single day. That clearly results in a material increase, a doubling in maize demand, even at that particular low income level. And let's just say, for argument's sake, income grows slightly further, but is still within the zone of a marginal household. In terms of a staple and subsistence functioning, that household may even then go to its third serving of maize. And I stick with maize simply because whether it is maize, whether it is rice, it's a staple, it's calories, it's the minimum of diet to sustain one's being. But let's just say income grows even further. It is likely that that household may resort then to reducing its maize consumption from 3 servings in a day to 2, and supplementing its diet with a cost-effective protein like chicken. Now, chicken enters the diet. Chicken is now consumed once a day, maybe even just once a week. But what I've guided you through is an S-curve for maize, where at some point in time the consumption of maize tops out, 3 servings a day, and even begins to recede. And then what kicks in is the consumption of protein, in this case chicken. So as you go through your income progression over time, from $1,000 of, say, monthly income to, if one is fortunate enough, $50,000 of monthly income, you go through the S curves of consumption. And this particular exhibit just wants to highlight to you the sweet spots of per capita income and where you reach your peak consumption of maize, of protein, of copper as an indication of a durable goods, a durable item. I'm going to be a little bit racy now, and again, because many of you would have been familiar with the context of my common framework, we looked at 3 countries in terms of our income study, to ascertain the graduation of households between the various income levels, low, middle, and high, Angola, Mozambique, and Zambia in this instance. In terms of Angola's income breakdown, and I have no doubt now you would have been well fed my pies, but I guess it's in the detail of these pies. You will notice, consistent with much of East Africa, of course, excluding South Sudan, consistent with much of West Africa, the last 15 to 20 years has been kind to much of the continent. And what you can see quite clearly from this exhibit is the manner in which the middle class has continued to swell over the last decade and a half, and the share of low-income individuals, again the share, has continued to slim. Consistent again with a high fertility rate, a high birth rate. You continue to see, even though the share of low income between, say, 2000 and 2014 subsided in terms of the nominal number of individuals, there was a more or less steady state, or at least we anticipate a steady state. So Africa continues to enjoy fairly robust fertility rates, even if in each particular segment there's almost a sense of growth, whether it is low, medium, or high. And again, there's repetition, even though the heterogeneity of the continent is something that I've alluded to plentifully. The upward income mobility within the low income segment is again echoed in the case of Angola. For those of you that would have been a little bit more focused on the data, Angola is one of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa that's got a relatively well-developed middle class in terms of its overall population. You may recall, for example, Ethiopia practically had no middle class, a truly fringe share of middle class, whereas Angola has got a very substantial share of middle class relative to its overall population, but again at the same time a substantial number of low-income individuals, so it brings to bear, perhaps in Angola's instance, high levels of inequality relative to, say, Ethiopia, where the mass really is functioning within the low-income sphere. Mozambique, economy there stumbled in recent years. There's been some concern surrounding public finance management, but it does appear that potentially Mozambique may show over the near to medium term some level of correction. You could argue that Mozambique may be on the cusp of where Ghana was, say, a year and a half ago, and may be releasing from that constriction that weighed on that market over the recent time. But Mozambique, truly a low-income country, less than $1,000 of per capita income, but scintillating growth for much of the last decade, at least up until the last 2 years or so, and perhaps at the cusp of, or at least thriving over the near term, even if we won't see a return to the double-digit growth that we were familiar with unless there is increasing policy certainty surrounding especially the extractive industry. Shifting to the low-income segment development, you will notice a consistent theme, a swelling in the numbers of low-income nominal heads, even if the share shrunk. And we think that, especially in the latter part of the next 15-year zone, we still think Mozambique, especially with a more enduring extraction of its hydrocarbon potential, could see, and it's a forecast, of course, a material lift in per capita GDP. The final market that I look at before introducing my guests is Zambia. And it's echoes of the same theme that I've shared with you over the last day and a bit, only of course different nominal numbers subject to the population share, but the themes, as I suggest, is consistent. Again, we know Zambia has had its own cyclical difficulties over the recent past, a function of headwinds to inclement weather, electricity production, some policy missteps as well. But that notwithstanding the cyclical way, and of course low commodity prices has been a generic theme through many other sub-Saharan Africans. And of course, this being the very last exhibit of the three-country analysis, you see upward mobility within that bottom of the pyramid. As I indicated, those would just have been introductory remarks. What I'd like to do at this stage is introduce my two guests to accompany me in just taking this dialogue slightly further. His Excellency, the former President of Botswana, Festus Mogae, I'm sure familiar with many of you, and he had the good grace to visit with us yesterday afternoon. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think you are, I think in the center, if I recall. Yes, sir. So no, forgive me, you're at the end, sir, please. And then, of course, we have the Minister of Trade, Tourism from Malawi. May I introduce Henry Mussa, Honorable Henry Mussa. Thank you, sir. Please take a seat in the center.
In the center. Thank you. Morning, sir.
Gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for partnering with me in this endeavor. We've generally had strong audiences and certainly a quality audience if I glance my gaze across the room. To start off with, His Excellency, Botswana has been a beacon of good governance. Botswana sometimes has stood at the top of the league tables, not just in sub-Saharan Africa or in the southern region, as a market of fine reforms. Admittedly, over the last few years, maybe in the last decade, it seems to have stumbled, and that's also been echoed in the growth rate. How do you judge near to medium-term prospects for Botswana and its broad, and just generally, to the extent that I know I feel slightly intimidated in your company because you're an Oxford-trained economist, so you may just highlight my inadequacies. How do you judge the region as well?
Well, charity beginning at home, I agree with you that we stumbled in the last decade in Botswana, and we are aware of that.
His Excellency, please, the microphone seems to have...
I don't know how to fix it.
Okay, no, there we go, there we go.
Could you help me? This one? All right. No, I was saying that I agree with you that in the last decade we stumbled. Some of it was brought up, we brought it upon ourselves. I think our present administration changed some of the policies that we had been pursuing since our independence. That, of course, that combined with inclement weather and the other adverse factors that affected production, including, of course, the fall in commodity prices. We are basically a mining economy, as you know.
Right.
But in addition, inappropriate policies were pursued, contrary to what was the case in our history, And that had an adverse impact on economic growth. So I think that's where we are. The government has, at long last, been looking back at what has happened, what went wrong. And they have admitted to themselves that, yes, there were adverse environmental factors. When I say environment, I mean economic environment, declining commodity prices, the inclement weather, in our case, the drought.
Right.
But also inappropriate policies which disrupted economic growth, in the sense that we changed our policies, residence permits and import permits became difficult. Whereas generally, the ease of doing business in Botswana was improving slowly over time. It deteriorated as a result of the introduction of very restrictive immigration and resident policy regulations. So I think that's where we are. But now we have a new package. Unfortunately, it's not yet published. I would be reading it. I suspect we're having a change in 31st March, we'll have a new president. I suppose, therefore, in agreement, presumably with the outgoing man, the new policies are going to be enunciated in March when the new president takes over. And they are very progressive, full of incentives for private sector and for everybody. So I'm very optimistic.
If I may just press you for a moment, imminently a change in leadership, and you've highlighted policy missteps. I think many would agree that, well, it's not just in Africa. One looks to Europe, one looks to the United States, and you see how leadership has altered the geopolitical landscape, let alone macroeconomics and microeconomics, the cost of doing business. This recurrent theme of leadership, many celebrate your tenure, many lament more recent quality of leadership on the continent. How does one cast a spotlight for a more reformed, pro-constitutionalist type of leadership, especially when many African leaders make reference to an African way to justify possibly the perpetuation of their tenure? How do you think about that?
I think that is a challenge. Basically, sometimes a leader in a particular country does so well that you tend to agree with the people. Say, for instance, Rwanda. Yeah. Rwanda is doing very well, and the people say they want the president to stay there. I tend to agree with them for now, but there are dangers in that. But in our case, we are not thinking along those lines. At least so far, we have followed strictly the term limits. The reason why we have a change of president next March is that that will be the 10th anniversary of the first coming into power of our current president, and he has to leave. We have to have a new president. In our case, I think we are looking forward to the new man. He is more open-minded, more traveled. Our president was a strongman. For a change, we have had a strongman president with a military background. Although he didn't come into power by coup, but he's a soldier by training, and we were not accustomed to his style, and he didn't think our traditions were all that wonderful after all. But we are glad he's going.
That was delightful. It's excellently, thank you. I think there's undercurrent of military instruction in so many African countries that has surfaced in recent times. Thank you for that. Honorable Minister Mussa, Malawi's lakes, there's a romance to your country. I think many tourists find it incredibly endearing. How do you judge the medium and near-term prospects for your zone, especially for a market that is bereft of shores? How do you judge your zone?
Well, thanks very much. The facilitator, my colleague, Excellency. First of all, let me deliver special greetings from my head of state, to the people of this country. Malawi is popularly known as the warm heart of Africa, and that is about people. The people of Malawi are warm, welcoming, hardworking, and charming. Malawi's economy is basically agricultural based. We do have cash crops that we grow: tobacco, coffee, tea, cotton, rubber as some of the cash crops. For our staple food is maize. We have sorghum, millet, beans. The list goes on. In terms of the natural resources that are there, obviously you talked about the lake. That in itself is a big attraction in as far as tourism is concerned in Malawi. This is one of our foreign currency spinner when it comes to tourism industry. But beyond that, Malawi is a mountainous country. We do have mountains, and beyond that, we do have lovely climate, weather. Yes, and to answer your question, the economy, to begin with, is projected to grow. This year, we are at 4% growth of our economy, and next year, we are projecting to hit 5%. And that in itself is exciting for us. This has been necessitated mainly by good prices in tobacco sales this year, including tea, coffee, rubber, as our cash crops. They did bring in lots of money, or they're bringing in lots of money in as far as the growth of our economy is concerned. We do have major players in our economy in terms of industry, for example, but the majority of Malawi's economy is driven by SMEs, small and medium-scale enterprises. They are the ones driving the economy, and more so the informal sector. And in our view, this is an area we are trying to nurture to make sure that it feeds into the major players. This year, we've done very well in terms of reforms. I was looking through the index of the doing business, for example. In Malawi, we've moved from 183 to 110. To us, this is good news. Indeed. What we've done from 2015 is to focus into the reforms, repealing of some laws. These are the archaic laws, coming up with new legislation. The doing business, for example, Companies Act has been reviewed, let alone the investment, and the export acts have been structured in such a manner that they fit in very well with the dynamics of industry. The other thing that is proving a success story in Malawi is its youthful population. Malawi's population, that of 17 million, 65 to 70% are youth. And when I say youth, that's from 40 years and below. What the government has done as the deliberate policy is to introduce what we're calling skills development. And these are very specific skills that have an impact into our development agenda. We're establishing community technical colleges where we're skilling our youth into trades like bricklaying, carpentry and joinery, ICT, tailoring. We're in this digital revolution as well, not forgetting the renewable energy technologies.
I'm mindful that I've presented this forum as a pop-up shop with the idea that it's a very crisp binge immersion exercise. I don't also want to be asking all the questions. Let me just turn over to the audience. Is there anyone with a burning desire to ask a question? This is a rare moment for you to seize. Are there any questions?
I would like to ask you a question.
You are usurping my authority, but His Excellency, I can't challenge you. So we got a microphone over there, and before you ask, is there another question, just so that I can harvest a few from the audience? No? Is there a second taker? No? In a moment, His Excellency.
No, you just give them time to think, to warm up. But and it's not a question. It's actually, I'm asking for clarification about South Africa generating growth and a certain percentage it going to the region. I thought in the case of Botswana, it's not quite. We are dependent on you for all our imports, almost. And when you do badly and the Rhine declines, we like it because imports become cheap from you. Our exports are to abroad. Our copper, nickel, our diamonds, our beef to the UK and Germany, and so on. Of course, we only export soda ash to you.
Right.
And that would affect. So when you do well, yes, we benefit, but not too much. We actually do benefit more when you do less well, because the currency declines and your goods become cheap, and I like that.
Okay. So while I conjure up an answer for that Oxford-educated arrow thrown at me, let me allow the gentleman over there to ask his question, please.
Good morning.
Yeah, we can hear you, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, everyone.
Please be so kind as to introduce yourself.
My name is Fanny Leshongwe.
Welcome.
I'm with Standard Bank, South Africa. I'm actually a colleague of Goolam. My question to His Excellency is basically what we read and understand is that the countries would go to SADC, for an example. There will be discussions and countries will agree on an integrated plan to move SADC forward. But once people leave the forum, it seems like the countries then do the opposite. You know, ease of doing business in countries like Mozambique seems to be going backwards. Okay. You know, countries like Botswana are moving forward. Countries like South Africa are going backwards. You know, how does the coordination need to happen, and who has to take charge of that coordination? That's my question.
Thank you. Okay, so it's in the realm of execution and political will, if I surmised correctly. Let me respond firstly to His Excellency's question. In my opening remarks, I suggested that mathematically, for every 1 percentage point of growth in South Africa, it has the potential to buoy the region. It's South Africa's near neighbors by anything between 0.4 and 0.8%. Obviously, it differs depending on the strength of linkages, and it's a net calculation as opposed to a gross calculation. In other words, as indicated, when South Africa slumps, there's a weaker currency that provides their translation gains, benefits for Botswana. But I'll just give you one transmission channel, His Excellency, just by way of example. South Africa's economy has been notably mired over the last few years. The fiscal position has deteriorated substantially. And directly, we share a common customs pool, and the transfers that are going to be made in that shared customs zone is going to be lower than it otherwise would have been. So that cause and call for fiscal consolidation amidst weak GDP growth is going to mean quite simply less fiscal flows to Swaziland, Lesotho, Namibia and so forth. And that's just one channel. And what we've done in our models, obviously we look at exports, imports, transfers. If South Africa is doing well, South Africans will tour the romance of Lake Malawi. Through that entire ensemble of relationships, you get a net impact. And we are just saying that on net, when South Africa is, you know, as I say, when you say a relationship is 0.8, that's an incredibly intimate level of relationship between two countries. And as I say, it relates to our quantitative work that says if you're in a good neighborhood, a buoyant neighborhood, as you would imagine, on a balance, it would be positive. But the question with regard to execution, His Excellency and perhaps Honorable Minister Mussa, if you could also supplement the remarks. The suggestion is these sometimes, forgive me, my words, these are talk shops where we gather, dine on the finest cuisine in such wonderful ambience,
red wine
and red wine and other more, and then we fail. Your view, please.
Well, I like red wine.
I'm suspicious of anybody who doesn't, but please.
I don't know why we African leaders are not taking our cooperation seriously, because what applies in SADC, in fact, applies in West Africa too,
right,
and applies in the African Union. We do a great many things and we agree, but when we go back home, we act otherwise. I don't know what we can do about that. So unfortunately, yes, it's happening in Southern Africa too, that we meet and we agree a certain set of policies. The other day, Mbeki said something at the AU, which is very true. He says that we African leaders don't tell each other the truth. And that's true. We don't tell each other the truth. We tend to agree at the AU, we tend to agree in SADC,
yes, but
when we go back to our countries, we do different things. That's also when sometimes us do wrong things. Of course, at present in Botswana, we have, as I told you now, we have a soldier for a president. The man is very antisocial. We are so embarrassed about it. Do you know he has never been to the AU? He has never been to the UN. He just goes riding horses, flying aeroplanes. He's a pilot, amongst other things. But anyway, we do attend the other meetings and so on. But that one, I really don't have an answer why we as African leaders agree on the right things, but then tend not to do them. But I can tell you, when I was president, whenever I said I did at home and elsewhere, you can ask my colleagues. They sometimes would rebuke me, but I did what I believe.
Okay.
Minister Mussa, your remarks?
Well, the former president has said it all. But suffice to say, though, that I think it's a generation that needs to shift out, or let there be a paradigm shift in how we do approach issues of development, for example. We do have reforms into change of the mindset on how to do business. We are saying, let's do it unusual and not as always usual. But when it comes to implementation, when it comes to doing the things, I totally agree with His Excellency here that we just grow cold feet in the process. But I see prosperity in Africa, again, in the way of our approach to business. What I'm trying to say is the reforms are taking place. The new generation is coming in now. They're more business-like. They're approaching to issues from a private sector's perspective. Otherwise, the public sector approach has always been business as usual. We'll look at it tomorrow, enjoy the parties as we head, and that has got to go. We will never develop as Africa if we continue with business as usual. That's the point we're making. Malawi has gone through all these reforms. We're calling them public sector reforms. But just timekeeping to say we start work at 7:30. Very few will be disciplined and be there at 7:30. Majority of them 10 o'clock. 2 or 3 hours later it disappears, and it's quite disheartening.
Gentlemen, I'm mindful that we've overrun by a few minutes. I am just, if that's okay with you, if you'll tolerate me and indulge me, just final remarks. We close this conference today. Sir, you are an elder statesman held in very high regard. You carry with you moral authority. You have a natural authority about you. There's not too many African leaders who, after their 10 years presidency, can hold society with such esteemed a relationship. Just your final last minute of remarks. There are investors, and clearly Dubai, the Emirates, maybe the broader Middle East will see itself as a co-gateway to participate in Africa. What's your parting shot to entice and strengthen that relationship?
I would say that in spite of all the admissions I have just made about our failures, I think on the whole we are marching forward, the region of Southern Africa. The present hiccups, I think, are temporary. I think I have said that in Botswana we are looking forward with great hope and expectations for our next president next March. Of course, you know there are elections in Southern Africa in 2019. Everybody goes to elections. Botswana, South Africa, Namibia, and so on. Malawi. And I'm looking to that with hope. I'm very optimistic. I think that what is taking place in South Africa, you are right, it's the engine of the region. It's adjustment that will take place, and I think by 2019 would bring certainty, and we will be going forward. So on the whole, I'm optimistic and proud of our region.
Thank you, His Excellency. Honorable Minister Mussa, your parting shot?
Well, my parting shot is to unfold the great opportunities that are prevailing in Malawi in terms of investments. Currently, we are now ready. This is like a juicy hanging fruit into mining industries, infrastructure development, tourism, agro-processing, just to mention but a few sectors that are ready for serious investors. Issues of health are also ready for investors into pharmaceutical manufacturing. Talk about education. It's another area that is also ripe for serious investors into education. The route to Malawi has a stopover. You fly out of, say, Dubai. If you want to go that way, South Africa, then 2 hours you're in Malawi. Or if you do it via East Africa, stopover in Nairobi, then Malawi, 2 hours thereafter. Or ET, that's Ethiopian Airways, you stop over in Addis, then 2.5 hours or 3 hours later, you are in Malawi. We are striking deals to see if some of these airlines can have stopovers in Malawi, like Emirates. 2 days ago, actually yesterday, we signed an aviation agreement for them to be, because they do fly into Zambia, Lusaka, Zimbabwe, that's Harare, South Africa, not Malawi. But this time around, we have concluded an agreement for them to be flying straight into Malawi. Ports, we export and import our goods through the Mozambican ports, the Beira, There's Nacala port, and at times we use the Dar es Salaam port. We have our own ambitious project to open up the Shire-Zambezi waterway as the shortest route to access the port of Chinde in Mozambique. It's a regional project. We have Mozambique, Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe as initial players into this. It's a COMESA project that are assisting us in developing that one.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I'll summarize and try to do this really rapidly. Within the confines of the 3 installments that we've had since yesterday afternoon, I think a few themes have emerged. Politics is the bedrock. You've got to have a macroeconomic plan. Execution needs to be intimate with that plan. We've spoken plentifully about power, logistics, and human capital and integration. The one word that I don't think was mentioned a single time, but I think it's permeated the conversation in one form or another, is accountability. There's a restlessness in Africa amongst its people. Technology has brought individuals closer to appreciating their lot. And I think that restlessness, combined with increasing urbanization, the usefulness of Africa's demography, it probably means that the capacity for leaders to perpetually be miscreant and not citizen serving will probably diminish. And I say this without any particular reference to a country, but it could be worse than having a military man at the helm of the leadership. You could have a gangster. And as I said, I make no reference to any particular country in that respect. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being so participatory. The pop-up store is again closed. Thank you. Bye-bye.